Okay, Shana Tova, Happy New Year, everybody. Good Yontif. Welcome. My name is Sharoni Sibony, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. This is in Hannah's Circle. This is the panel discussion on fertility and infertility and being child-free. And I wanted to note again that this program is being recorded. And to give you just a moment's context for what we're doing today. So because it's Rosh HaShanah and because in Judaism we see study as an act of devotion, we are so pleased to have this opportunity to learn together in community on the afternoon of our highest holy days on the calendar. So we get together on the afternoon of Rosh Hashanah and then again on the afternoon of Yom Kippur next week to gather and to learn and to deepen our understanding of Torah and to deepen our relationships to community. Before I introduce our presenters for today, I'm going to take a moment to do our land acknowledgement and just to remind everybody of some basic Zoom functions. I see that somebody's still struggling to connect to audio and won't hear me until they do, I guess, but we will make do. So we want to start by acknowledging that the land on which Holy Blossom operates is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto, or Tikaronto, is covered by Treaty 13, which is signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Holy Blossom Temple is working toward developing deeper relationships with our Indigenous neighbors to increase our historical understanding and to find new paths to actions that will help heal and renew the strengths of the Indigenous communities of this land. If you're interested in learning more about the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I'm going to drop the link into the chat. Oh, there are more people in the waiting room, sorry. And you may choose to write to your elected officials to encourage greater implementation of these recommendations, if you are so moved. So here is the link for the report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I see it didn't do what it was supposed to do, so you may just have to copy and paste that. It's not entirely hyperlinked. So as we're gathering today, welcome, Shana Tova. I've just done the land acknowledgement, and again, my name is Sharoni Sibony for those of you just coming in. I invite you to rename yourself if your name is not part of your visible screen presence, and to please keep yourself muted at all times. There will be an opportunity, we hope, at the end to make comments or ask questions, and we're going to leave about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end, so you will be able to unmute at that point if you wish and contribute to the conversation. And I am going to enable auto captioning for this event because apparently I haven't done it yet. This event is being recorded. There is no auto captioning function here. If you need auto captioning, please message me privately and I will call out for help to somebody else because that is not part of this Zoom function. My apologies. I will be monitoring the chat. You can post questions to everyone so that the presenters can see your questions, or you can message me privately if you want to solve any issues that arise. You can do that in the chat function, and you can also at the end use the raise hand function if you wish to come off mute and speak. We'll call on you in time. So now, welcome to the last people who've just come in. Again, this is being recorded and my name is Sharoni Sibony and I am the Adult Education Coordinator now at Holy Blossom Temple. I just started 3 weeks ago, so this is my first program with the community and very excited to get to meet many of you and to get to learn more about you and who you are and what you need from the community. For the moment, I'm going to start by introducing our panel and then offering some framing remarks, and then we're going to get into the discussion because we've pulled together a really magical panel for today. It's really an honor to introduce today's teachers, if I can call you all that. You're all my teachers today. So among the people we have with us today is Alex Johnston. Alex's first book, Inconceivable, My Life-Altering, Eye-Opening Journey from Infertility to Motherhood, was published by Sutherland House in May 2021. Alex is also the CEO and one of the founders of the 360 Concussion Care, an integrated network of concussion clinics offering physician-led multidisciplinary care and operating as a learning health system to develop and share world-leading concussion research and best practices. And this is an organization worth checking out if you know anyone who suffers from post-concussion symptoms. And if you're like me, you probably do know people. Between 2012 and 2016, Alex ran the Canadian office of Catalyst Inc., which is a global nonprofit advocating for the advancement of women in business, where she worked closely with some of the most influential CEOs and business leaders in Canada on strategies to accelerate progress for women. She has a deep and broad policy background, having served as a senior policy advisor in the Ontario government for justice, social, and women's issues, and later executive director managing the policy team for Ontario Premier Dalton McGuinty between 2003 and 2011. And you can read more about the boards on which she serves and has served. She grew up in Montreal and now she's in Toronto. And her bio, her full bio with a little bit extra information is posted on our website when you can find the information about this panel. Our next guest is Heather Shapiro, who is a member of Holy Blossom Temple and also a well-known fertility specialist at Mount Sinai Fertility in Toronto and an associate professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Toronto. Dr. Shapiro, I'm going to call you Heather with your permission, is a graduate of McMaster University Faculty of Medicine and a graduate of the Obstetrics and Gynecology Residency Program at U of T. And she has spent many years helping people start a family and teaching the next generation of women's health providers. She's the former Vice Chair of Education in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the past president of the Canadian Fertility and Andrology Society, and current member of the Clinical Practice Guidelines Committee. Her research interests include improving access to fertility care and understanding fertility decision-making. And Heather and her family have been with Holy Blossom since 1992, and she has served as the liaison for our Shin Shinim program and as a board member, and her children all attended Leo Beck Day School. And our third guest for today is, oh, thank you for the notes, by the way. Our third guest for today is Devin Speer, and Devin is a friend, and I'm privileged to call her a friend. She is an author, rabbinical student, and digital theologian who weaves and teaches others to weave their own theology through poems, prose, and digital images. She currently serves as the 2021 liturgist in residence for the National Havurah Committee, where I got to learn with her some prayer workshops earlier this year. Morning prayer exercises with Devin are wonderful. And she resources Jewish movements, networks, and denominations to explore the intersections of hope and hopelessness, trauma and recovery, humor and doubt, as well as loneliness and safekeeping. Utilizing a palette of Torah, personalized psalms, and trauma-informed somatic body practice, Devin's work has been consulted and published by the London School for Jewish Studies, the Reconstructing Judaism Movement, Central Conference of American Rabbis, Liberal Judaism, and the National Council of Jewish Women. An advocate for encounter across difference in the global religious community, she has been recognized by the Ontario government as a recipient of the Leading Women Building Communities Award. And most recently, she has birthed a book. Devin is the author of the best-selling book of poetry, Whatever It Is, Gently, Quiet Meditations for the Noise of the Pandemic. So, welcome to all of you. Welcome to our guests today who are listening in. And I really am very moved, more than excited, I think, to have assembled this stellar panel. I've got a physician, a memoirist and advocate, and a rabbinical student and a liturgical innovator all together here. And I've invited you all together to help us unpack a set of questions that have troubled so many of us in our community. And I want to start by saying that I know that the High Holy Days can be a very fraught time in the calendar for a lot of people. This is a time when typically, not COVID, we gather together, usually in very big synagogue spaces, and there are thousands of people. And maybe we rejoice in seeing people we haven't seen in a year, or people we went to camp or school with, people that we served on a committee with some years ago. It's kind of like a parade. And maybe we've come a little bit to see and be seen some years. But sometimes we also wish that we could stay invisible in the crowd. And sometimes our own inner worlds are at odds with this parade scene. And maybe we're holding on to grief and pain, the grief of loss or longing, the grief of expectations unmet, or the hopes still unfulfilled. And I know that it can be very hard to feel so alone and so isolated in a sea of smiling faces, especially when synagogue is a place where a lot of us come with family and associate intergenerational continuity with this space and with this experience. For me, I was thinking about this in advance. I remember sitting on my father's lap as a child during High Holy Day services, and I would braid the fringes of his talit, his prayer shawl. And I just remember the feeling of intimacy and closeness and comfort as the liturgy just washed around me and all the people were sort of swimming around us. And I think that into my 30s, I mostly imagined that I would be able to recreate that scene with children of my own at some point. And when I was in my mid-30s, I wasn't partnered and going to synagogue, which was really one of the last few places that my family went together as an activity, my parents and my brother and I mean. It became really hard to go to synagogue. I often felt like I was the last single person standing. I watched a lot of my peers take their kids downstairs to kids programming, and I felt really alone in a place that was supposed to bring me comfort and connection. And my own story isn't a story of infertility. It's a story that I've just kind of come to a time in my life and maybe a choice where I'm not going to have kids, at least not biological kids. And I don't think I'm going to go the kid route at this stage. But I really wanted to make space today on this Hayom Harat Olam, this day on which the infinite is born, a day replete with birthing metaphors, to bring this conversation forward in the context of a synagogue specifically. And I wanted to bring these people together to shed some light and softness on these very real and deeply heartfelt struggles. For so many of us in community, the path to new family life is full of obstacles, and it's often a silent, secret, and stigmatized struggle that we hide from each other. And I'll come back to talking a little bit more about Naomi Less later in the questions that I'm asking the panelists today. But Naomi Less, if you haven't seen her, is a spiritual leader at Lab Shul in New York. And she talks about what Alex has elsewhere called an epidemic of infertility, an epidemic that is statistically higher within the Jewish community than it is by comparison to the national average, at least in the US, where I was reading the stats. And Less likens a visit to a fertility specialist to walking into the Jewish General Assembly, where she knew half the people in the room. And it turns out, of course, that infertility of one sort or another is something that too many of us in the Jewish community face, but rarely discuss. So we put this panel together so that we can ask these questions about how our community can better support people of all genders through the journey of raising the next generation. And for those of us like myself who face an unclear place in community as child-free person, as child-free adult, I don't think I can be alone in wondering, like, where do I fit when I don't follow the scripted family path? And if we can't, or if we choose not to become parents, what alternative Jewish futures can we imagine beyond this Jewish procreation narrative? How else can we be fruitful? And at the core of that, I think I'm really asking, what does it mean to love and support community and to be loved and supported by community? So I'm going to start with the part that I personally find maybe the hardest. This is a common Jewish framework for this kind of conversation. And that is that the centrality of procreation into Judaism's core narratives really can't be understated. The Bible's first blessing, which the rabbis then interpret as a commandment, not just a blessing, it's the first thing that God says to humans once God creates humans, is pru orvu, be fruitful and multiply. And the book of Genesis goes on to trace continuity and cultural transmission through begettings, Noah begot 3 sons, who begot 9 more generations, until we arrive at Abram, right, Abraham. And it goes on like that. And so this emphasis on be fruitful and multiply, makes its way into our collective teaching and thinking about how to fulfill a Jewish life in community. So Heather, I'm going to turn it over to you first. And I want to know how, in what ways has this teaching been an influence on your own career path or on your own spirituality or Jewish life? And how do you see this opportunity or this imperative of reproduction weighing on your Jewish patients in particular?
Well, firstly, thank you for the wonderful introduction, starting with the land acknowledgement and your personal stories. And again, I'm so flattered to be with this group. I've already learned more in the last 2 minutes than I anticipated I'd learn in the hour. Having said that, I feel like I might have gotten a really hard question to start with. I agree with you. Be fruitful and multiply has turned into the centrality of family, which is, I think, what a lot of people feel. I think that there is some nationhood building that goes on with be fruitful and multiply, which isn't necessarily what the individual person has, but as you said, over generations, it translates into that. I guess I would say 2 things. I would say, number one, my bias, so to speak, is I do believe in the universality of the desire to parent. It's not for everybody, but I do think it transcends many cultural barriers. So I do think of it not as specifically a Jewish problem. What I do think is very Jewish is that we believe in actions. And I have to say, Israel, as you might know, has one of the most supportive fertility programs in the world. So in Israel, all women up until the age of 45 can essentially have unlimited fertility services until they've had 2 children, and up to age, I think, 54 if they're using a donated egg. So I think that speaks to how Israel, which is not necessarily how all Jews, but at least how Israel views the centrality of family and reproduction.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely ties into the idea of nation building for sure, right? There's definitely an agenda there to do a kind of population replacement or growth. But yeah, how our own individual stories get wrapped up in that too is an interesting question. I don't know that we'll necessarily explore that because it's a bit more theoretical and maybe political, but it's worth noting for sure. Yeah. Alex, I want to turn it to you for a second because I was reading in your book that you talked about how easy pregnancy was for your mom. And that at one point, I think you said that she had 5 children in the span of 7 years and was like, what, she was winning a tennis match the night before she gave birth to you or something. So there's like this setup in your family, I think, about this expectation of what it would be to be fruitful and multiply. And I wonder if you can pick up on that thread and talk a little bit about your family expectation and what your own journey has been like. Like, how did that change when you started to focus on your own family building?
Sure. And Sharoni, thanks for framing such a great discussion. You did such a beautiful job setting it up. My mom did have 5 girls in 7 years. And I think when I went into this, she was 25 when she started her family. I was 32. And it never crossed my mind I would have difficulty because somehow her fertility seemed to define our expectation in terms of what our own family building experience would be like. I think the challenge I had when I jumped into this is beginning to understand that I had very little awareness around my own body. And when I started to really unpack that, it was clear that I wasn't alone. My peer group had very little awareness about our own body and our own fertility. I think what surprised me is, I was a lawyer, I was disciplined, I was organized, I would do due diligence on things that mattered to me. And what ended up being this hugely consequential choice in my own life was something that I felt in many ways I had left to chance. And I haven't spent a huge amount of time beating myself up over that. I was trying to understand how at 32 I entered into family building with very little knowledge about me and an assumption that I would be just like my mom. And clearly the difference between starting at 25 and starting at 32 is very different. I think the thing that I tapped into was a very fierce desire to be a mother. And a big part of why I wrote the book is I felt that that choice as to whether or not you become a parent is so profound. And I would do a huge amount to empower women to be able to make an informed choice. And so whether you choose to be a parent or choose not to be a parent, for me, that active choice is the fundamental issue. And I almost lost mine for no other reason than I didn't know anything about my fertility. And once I started, my fertility was already compromised, and it set off a very difficult path for me and my husband to become parents, which ultimately we did.
Thank you. Yeah. I think that'll resonate with a lot of people, I'm sure, right? I know I was thinking about it as I was looking at your book and thinking, I had a great grandmother on my father's side who allegedly, according to family lore, was 12 or 13 when she was married in Morocco and started having children like a year later and just kept reproducing. Like she is said to have had 25 children. So there's like this sense of if fertility runs in the family, then like, oh, it'll be easy, right? But sometimes it changes environmentally and generationally and things. I mean, I'm sure Heather can speak to that more accurately and scientifically than I can, but I'm going to turn it to Devin for a second and ask you, not a second, but for a moment, and ask you to think about this with us a little bit. This idea that our canonical texts are focused so much on the importance of childbearing and child rearing, but they're not actually telling us that much about the experiences of the people who do that work. So how do we find the voices of the people with those experiences? And can you help shine a light for us a little bit on the texts in our tradition and what they say to us about expecting or not expecting?
Absolutely. I just want to begin by saying I'm just so grateful to be here. Pirkei Avot, one of the texts of our tradition, 1 verse 6 talks about, that you should make a teacher and also to make a friend. And I feel like I've made many just even in the few minutes I've been here, just to soak in your wisdom. And I also just want to say a thank you. She's not present with us right now, but just to Rabbi Splansky and the Torah that she shared in 2015 of her body and her journey with breast cancer has been so formative to me as both a human being and a rabbinical student, even by osmosis. So that Chaim Stern translation of making a teacher and a friend, that learning is a constant cycle of teaching and becoming and creating, but also of listening. I feel like I learned so much about listening to my body from Rabbi Splansky. So just a special thank you to her for her Torah and to each of you for yours. Wow, where to begin? I'm going to speak personally and I'm going to speak textually. I like a little bit of both. I'm Devin, as you know, and I'll share personally, I'm adopted. I've been blessed in my life to have wonderful Jewish grandparents, including great-grandparents who were co-founders of the first kibbutz in Israel. I was definitely raised with a deep sense of pride and I would say resilience in knowing that the human spirit can withstand and stand anything in this world. So I want to just say thank you to my great-grandparents and my grandparents, specifically my bubby. And it's complicated. I'm a complicated person. I'm a survivor of incest, and I'm a rabbinical student, and I'm a liturgist. I also like fun colored glasses, and I'm very irreverent, and I make a lot of jokes, mostly at inappropriate times. So we're going to talk a little bit about a very complicated thing today, and I'll use some humor and some levity and some seriousness, because this is hard stuff that we're talking about. I want to call in that, and this comes from actually a poet, the poet Zelda. And I was thinking, as Shironi was saying, that, the language of begettings, that, that this commandment to procreate, to continue, really colors how we view our bodies and ourselves, sometimes as people who are women, sometimes as people who aren't women, as people, as humans, what we do with our body, even as men, all, each in different ways. But also after the flood, when the generations are listed, sometimes people read these, if you go into the Torah and you read, okay, this is the generation of so-and-so who begot this person and this and da 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 da. You get the sense of like, okay, maybe if you're like me, liminally fertile, I'm also a person with PCOS. And you read that and you might think, oh, like, I can't, or I sometimes can, and I don't know what to do with this verse. But the poet Zelda speaks of something that really resonates with me. And now whenever I read in Torah that these are the generations of so-and-so and this ancestor and that, I don't just read generations as this is who begot who from this person and that. I read it as these are the generations, but these are the names. And I read every name. And I recall Zelda's words that everyone has a name to our enemies, a name to our work. I just have to read you a part of this because it's just so beautiful. Given by those we love, a name given by those we serve. Each of us has a name. So imagine going into that text and we could read it as, this really big invocation of, should I be pregnant or not? And on this day, the world, and it's translated, either, this is the day of the world's birth, this is the day of the world's eternal pregnancy, to use a more modern translation by Aviva Richman, it's a rabbi. But I like to think of it, this is the day that I remember the names. I remember the names of my 4 people. And when I go into this book and I look at all the people that I come from, adopted, complicated, striving, still believing in the human spirit despite everything, I read those names. And so when the prophet Jeremiah speaks in the text that we read today of, going into the state of eternal pregnancy because of the despair that he's feeling, I read it not necessarily as an invocation of fertility and of right bodies and of the need to produce, but of actually the need to just be in birth. I come from all the birthings of all the people that came before me, and they were messy like mine. I have beautiful grandparents. I have wonderful friends. I have a beautiful husband. And I believe I was put on this earth not necessarily to produce physically children, which I think is such a wonderful, wonderful gift, but I was put here to love very deeply. And I think the names, when I read the names of my ancestors and my 4 people, I think this is the day of the world's birth. And it's the day that we recognize that each of us is here for a reason. I want to end with one small piece of Torah quickly, that this is on Rosh HaShanah, and this is from Talmud, 10b, 10, Rosh HaShanah. On Rosh HaShanah, the world was created. Our 4 people were born. Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah, our ancestors, they were remembered, they conceived. But also Joseph was let out of the dungeon. There's a lot of lives in this verse. You've got people who are pregnant that we're descended from. You've got people that are, in struggle with their freedom and in a strange land. We're living right now amidst a time of the Shabbat of the world, of the Shemitah year, of this release of debts and of obligations, and of coming back to the earth. And I want us to think that, when it comes to the body and how complicated it is for a human lifespan, that it is possible to find these voices by starting with the names of the people that have gone before us, but also our own names, what was chosen for us, what we are choosing, what we can choose no longer. And what does it say that the creation of the world also was fulfilled on the day that we rested and that we stopped a little bit? So how do we stop? How do we remember? And how do we stay true to the names that we are choosing for our lives and the lifespans that are, our ancestors, but also deeply ours, to remember on this Shabbat of the world. On this day, the world was born. Many births are possible, and they are arriving here and after.
Devin, that's Beautiful, thank you. It's interesting because when I teach in other contexts, I often end up teaching at some point about ancestry. And I ask people to think about the genealogy of their ancestry, that not their family lineage necessarily, but who do they claim as ancestors? And for me, as a longtime student of literature, for example, that would have been the Jane Austens and George Eliots and everybody in the British canon for a long time. And then maybe it was, and it definitely was actually a lot of literary critics, right? But there are lots of ways I have intellectual forebears who function as my ancestors also and have generated a worldview for me or created worldviews that maybe I'm in contest with and in discussion with. And what you're talking about also reminds me of Lila Saad, who talks about being a good ancestor and what does it mean to become a good ancestor to future generations, right? How to be a good ancestor. And I think that that's something that I love the way you're opening it up so that it's not just about birth and family lineage necessarily, right? I want to turn to the story of Hannah because this is the story that we're reading on Rosh HaShanah. And it's the story after which we've named today's panel. So we're introduced to Hannah as a figure in the Bible in the book of Samuel 1. And when we first meet her, we're really only told, as these texts often don't have that much in them, or they have a lot compressed into very little space, like you just said, Devin, right? We're just told that she is apparently the second wife. She's presented as the second in order in the text of Elkanah, and that the first wife, Peninnah, has children, but Hannah does not. And we know that there are a lot of social pressures on Hannah in this story because Peninnah taunts her quite relentlessly and makes her cry and makes her unable to eat. So Hannah goes to the temple, the holiest place, to pour out her heart. This is something that women apparently did not do. And so she's standing at the wall of the temple in anguish and distress, beseeching God for a child. And while she's there, the high priest Eli sees her and mistakes her for being drunk and harshly tells her to leave. And I think that for many of us, this is a story that might be very hard to read, and sometimes maybe we avoid Rosh Hashanah some years because, I know people who don't come to services because it's a story they don't want to face at a certain moment in their lives. This is a woman who has come to the source of strength, to the temple itself, in her most vulnerable state. And she is harangued by her peer, and she is instead of being met with a welcome, she's met with hostility by the community leader. So I wonder if any of you want to pick up that thread and talk a little bit about places in your lives where you've met with a Peninnah or an Eli who didn't understand at first, didn't see what your suffering was or where you were masking it. Maybe a little bit about the social pressures that you've faced in your lives, or Heather, that you know that your patients have faced. What kind of social pressures or stigma are people facing, and what are the ways in which we can set up a better tone for community support? Are there Eli figures, community leaders who haven't said the right thing? Do they recount that, Heather, to you as part of do your patients recount that to you as part of their experience? Or Alex, is that something that you've encountered in your own journey? Or a Peninnah figure, the people who make it seem like it should be so easy somehow, right? Does anybody want to pick that up? I don't know who wants to go first on that.
I was going to say, I think the lived experiences are much more powerful, so I'll defer to my colleagues.
I think there is a huge amount of pressure, and my obsession really is this element of choice. And so whether you choose to have a child or not is important. Whether you choose to have a child on your own, if you don't have, all of the pieces in place, and to have support in doing that is important. But choice is fundamental. I think I experienced a ton while I was going through it, and there's both a lack of awareness around infertility. My assumption when people are married and within 3 or 4 years they haven't had children is they may very well be struggling. That question is really loaded, and the do you have kids question, which is a normal connector question, can be very loaded. And I remember being at a dinner once, and I had been asked the question so many times, do you have kids? And I'd say no. And then people would jump into, you're so lucky and it's so tiring and you can sleep in on Sundays. And, I remember thinking, I'm suffering so much here. I'm trying so hard. We had lost our first child by then. And I remember feeling like I can't go through this conversation again. And I told the man beside me, who was a president at one of the universities, my first child just died. And I remember thinking, it is so unfair to him. We had such a deep conversation, but it turned things into a direction that he had not anticipated. And I remember thinking, there's no easy way of managing this conversation. If I say, no, I don't have kids, people make assumptions about my reasons. If I say, this is my reality, it's far too much information to convey to a stranger, and there was no easy way to navigate it. I would just say, if we can, in asking the question, be open to different realities, if we can try to minimize judgment and pressure, you can end up in beautiful conversations with people about their choice. But it is a loaded question, and I think we need to ask it with sensitivity, understanding that people have very different realities, and just be mindful of that.
Thank you. Yes. Heather, did you want to pick up on that thread?
No, that's very true. I think we never know where people are coming from. And I think it's a life lesson to always be sensitive to people's realities that are very different than yours. And of course, people who ask that question are only doing it with the best intentions, but it's very hurtful, very hurtful. I mean, Alex mentions it in her book, and I hear it in my patients all the time. I can't go to family functions anymore. People mean well, but I just can't face that world when I'm in so much pain and so not a part of it. And I might add just that is one of the things that sometimes makes people leave fertility treatment, because the pressure is just too much to bear. And I wonder if it is a conscious choice or a choice because the other alternatives are just so awful too, which is unfortunate.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a conversation that doesn't happen very often, or doesn't get filtered into our community spaces very well. And I wonder, Devin, and maybe Heather, you too, maybe Alex in a different community, maybe you also have an idea of this. What kinds of words of comfort and kindness do you wish that you could put into the mouths of our communal leaders and spiritual leaders when it comes to this framework of Jewish family life today? Like, what do you want to hear from the podium, from the bima? I wonder if that's something that you've considered or that you want to speak to. Devin?
I'm just thinking, this time around, I want to say maybe 6 or so years ago, that's when about it started. I had a major onset of an illness that relates to my ovaries. And my husband and I had just been married a few months prior, and I started rabbinical school, and it all happened at once. We were standing outside, and I couldn't tell the community I was a part of at the time that this is what I was struggling with, amidst a lot of other issues, including really struggling to come to terms with periods in my life where there were quite a lack of money, and dealing with the consequences on my body of not being able to afford healthcare to process some of these experiences I had as a child, as an adult, in between. And we were outside, and I was like, I can't tell this community because I feel like such a failure, I'm not going to be able to conceive at this point. My knees were losing functioning. I was finding it very hard to move. Grabbed a pile of leaves, and I just said, let's just hold these leaves together, and let's just, find it in ourselves. And we just watch the leaves kind of drop from our hands on this fall street, this time 6 years ago. And I just said to him, this is so much, and I don't know how to let go of this burden and even talk about it. Like, this is my suffering, but I want to, God, find it in me to share it. I need to find a way to talk about this, but I don't know how yet. And we started by just releasing it into the wind, these leaves. And, you know, fast forward to 6 years after that, and now I chose to write about this journey. My first book, when I was bedridden and very, very sick, talked about these experiences of our ancestors, not from the perspective of, you know, are you drunk now, Hannah? You know, or just like, tell me what you don't have, or, you know, or like, how's this thing? You know, it was actually these images that I had. You know, my friend and I made this book in a 24-hour McDonald's. It was the only place in our small town that was open. And we put together these photos of Jews as we really are. Jews in tattoos, Jews struggling in the waiting room, Jews in wheelchairs, Jews in long-term health facilities, as we are and as we aren't. And so I share those stories about the leaves and the letting go, but not knowing how, and the stories and the writing with hope that, you know, from the Bima, that it's not just that we get to hear words of comfort, but we also get to turn the mic to people who are really suffering so that these conversations can happen much, much more. You know, the words that came to mind of like, what could we hear? You know, you're still a person. Thanks for showing up. You know, you don't have to do anything right now. You don't have to make anything. What do you need? That was really the question for me when my body started to break through major illness. And also as a result recently of this disclosure of incest. There's a lot that happens to your body when you share a secret like this. And it relates to fertility because there were pieces of my endocrine system very deeply affected by that experience I had. And I guess I often wonder if sometimes just people want somebody to just sit by them and listen. Maybe it's not so much the words or the right thing or the fixing or the telling. It's just, how do I just have someone who can just be here? So in my student rabbinic work, I find myself sitting a lot of the time with people and just paying attention, and their words and their stories come. So I think I'm interested in what can happen in a world where, again, you know, the culmination of the world is a period of rest, of this, you know, this world to come that is not just production or what we have now, but, you know, literally a world that is at rest. And what does it mean to be at rest with each other in acceptance of the messy middles in the waiting room of life? So that's where I find myself, just paying attention.
Thank you. Yeah. Heather or Alex, I don't know if you want to pick up on anything that Devin just said. I want to give you an opportunity if you want to react. Not that you have to, but I'm struck by that because I have a similar framework for thinking about my relationship to chronic illness, episodic illness in community. Also, it's something I've talked a lot about in the last year and a half, and have been teaching about and making art about and stuff. And there's nonetheless something that maybe it's the words we don't want to hear sometimes from the leaders. I don't know. I think there's like a tone setting. I hear what you're saying, and I really appreciate what you're saying about listening to everybody, like sitting beside somebody and just giving them the space, holding space for people, right? I mean, I hope that that's part of what we're trying to do today as a group. And I think also for me, there's something in the persistence of this language of procreation narrative that I wish that maybe our leadership could soften and turn on itself in different ways and open up in different ways like we're trying to do today. So I think that there is a kind of onus in my mind still on the leadership, spiritual leadership, certainly, to like have a softer voice about all of this, and not only reinforce this, like, I mean, especially because there's such an emphasis on, like, if you look at the reporting, I mean, Heather, you touched on this a little bit as the pro-natalist agenda, let's call it, right? The nation building kind of agenda. Like, this is every Pew study that comes out of the US about Jewish community is like, it's, you know, there's always these questions about how's our fertility rate, how's our birth rate, how's our replacement rate as a community. This is a question that preoccupies demographers and donors. So I think in terms of a leadership conversation, I want more elasticity still myself. I don't know if anybody has thought about that. I know we're going to come to a question about advocacy and policy work in a little bit, so maybe you'll pick up that thread a little bit in that space, if you don't mind, Alex and Heather. Or Alex, do you want to say something about it now?
I'll just say one quick thing, because you touched on it when you described going into a shul. I think I have a line in the book, and I was trying to capture what the experience with other people was like, and they were struggling with me and suffering with me. But I wrote, you know, sometimes people want to love you the way they want you to be loved, which isn't necessarily the way you need to be loved. And for me, it wasn't a question of how much people loved me. It was people looking at me and trying to figure out how to add value in that place, in that time that was value we needed. And different people ended up being part of that kind of healing circle and journey. And we had to find lots of people on the other side. But that concept of loving people the way they need to be loved is very powerful. And I felt like, you know, that piece to me is fundamental. It's just not trying to problem solve. And Devin touched on that. You can't fix it. You have to sometimes just be with people and looking at them and trying to figure out how they need to be loved. For me, was hugely important for the people who really ended up carrying us through our, you know, difficult 6 or 7 years building our family.
Thank you. Yeah.
I would like to say something.
Sorry, I saw that your hand was up, but apologies. We're going to save questions for the end from the floor. Okay.
I don't require a comment.
Or comments. We're going to save questions and comments till the end. Sorry, thanks. We've got some stuff to walk through here first, and we've asked people to hold their thoughts till the end. Thanks. So I want to pick up again on the theme of the Hannah story. So one of the things that Hannah gets celebrated for is a kind of religious invention. She's a religious inventor in a sense in the Jewish tradition, and the rabbis of the Talmud pick up on the fact that she invents silent prayer in a system that was based otherwise on sacrificial rite. And Ellie doesn't recognize what she's doing at the temple wall, in part because A, she's a woman probably, and B, she's like nobody else has gone there to offer their own silent prayer, even at this house that we today associate with prayer. It wasn't the place of prayer back then. So the rabbis saw something so powerful and valuable in that spontaneous and heartfelt plea that she was offering. And I want to know, Alex, I'm going to turn to you first on this one, that you have made a very public, you've made your very private experience very public through the publishing of your memoir and through all your speaking engagements. And I think that there's so much power in that, in the same way that there is in Hannah's cry. So I'm curious to know what kind of response you've had in reaction to the book itself, and what kind of conversations it's opened up for people, or what kind of change it's engendered.
You know, when I wrote the book, I really wanted to write a book about infertility. And when I did the first incarnation of this and we sent it to publishers, it was resoundingly rejected. And they said, no one wants a policy book on infertility. And what we agreed, me and my exceptional book agent, was you have to embed it in a very personal narrative and story and experiences to engage people in this important topic. And then you have to weave learnings in there that are subtle but meaningful and powerful. Having done that, what has surprised me is the way it resonates with different people is often not a story about family building and infertility, but you know, I've had people say this to me as a story about grief and loss, and it resonated with me because I had this own experience in my own life. I've had people disclose to me, I assume people would share their family building stories. What happens when you share yourself is people know much more about you than you know about them. So even people I've known for many years on a certain level are now disclosing experiences in their own life that were transformational, that aren't about infertility, but are really about significant things that they went through. So it's opened up conversations like that. You know, people have said it's a story. I have a beautiful friend who just lost her brother to cancer. And she said, for me, it was a story about adult sibling relationships. So I think in sharing the story around infertility and being very personal about what this journey was like for me, for my family, for our support community, both having our kids, losing a child, and undertaking many different steps to build our family, there's a lot in there. And my surprise has been the different things that people pick up on. And at the end of the day, it feels like it's a very human story. And the humanity, even more than the infertility awareness, is what people are connecting to, which has frankly been a very beautiful experience and not what I anticipated, because I'm a mission-focused person. I'm purposeful. The book is purposeful. It's designed to advocate. It's designed to inform. And the experience of sharing this story has been really very human and very profound, well beyond the infertility learnings that I hope would come out of it.
That's wonderful. I'm glad of that for everybody in your community, for yourself, and like getting to know people more deeply, and for the others. Heather, do you find that you've, like in the time that you've been working in this field, have you observed any particular power in the patients? Have patients been able to make any changes, advocate for any kind of funding or other, I don't know, just changing the landscape of fertility treatment? Is that where some of the power sits?
Yes, I mean, I would just like to say that, just to echo what everyone's saying, that the loss of dreams is a real loss. And I think that that's what you're hearing is the commonality, and what to do and what to say is probably in some ways not that different than what you would say to anybody that you know who is feeling pain. And you need to, potentially strip away your biases and your values and support them. But it's hard sometimes for people to speak out. I think that that's, again, a bit of a systems problem, that policies have been made by policymakers and doctors and people in the front line. And I think it's been a good evolution over the last maybe 10 years or less, that we appreciate that the key stakeholders obviously are the patients. And so now we are absolutely having stakeholders participate at many different levels. The challenge there is that no two stories are the same. So you can't have one person represent all patients, even 10 people can't represent all patients. But as a group, do I think patients can make a difference? Absolutely. I mean, the old adage that the political is personal and vice versa. So stories are powerful, and the more stories we share, the more empowered the patients are, the better it will be for everyone. Absolutely.
Thank you. That's very hopeful. Devin, you want to pick up on that?
I wanted to pick up on the piece about, stories being powerful. And I think Heather had said a line about, to be with people in pain, about kind of like, you strip away your values, your beliefs, and you just kind of, you're with them through what they're experiencing. And Alex, certainly through your experience, have touched on that about, loving people according to what they need, which is a profound act. And I think, there's so much to a human lifespan that we often don't talk about. And I think the fertility conversations often in public miss that in the Jewish community, in the mainstream. There's a sense of kind of like getting to the finish line, or like having the right family. I remember I passed a period in my 20s where I felt like I don't have a dog, I don't have a house, I'm losing my hair. I lost most of my hair last year. And I'm like, what do I offer? What do I have? And there are other narratives that I think can come also through the fertility narratives of just sort of, the pro-natalist pieces that can be about who gets to be supported and who gets to be nurtured and who gets to be paid attention to in community. And I think there needs to be a place to talk about, those that we're missing when it comes to people who aren't in the building, who aren't on the Zoom, who aren't around us, but are. In this pandemic, we know disproportionately that non-binary and women, people who are dealing with extreme levels of poverty and injustice and chronic conditions, pre-existing conditions, so health issues that are longstanding, are dealing with the brunt of this. And it's so challenging. And in Jewish communities, I think the question to ask as we think about this birthday of the world, and we think about, okay, the state of eternal, pregnancy, as it were, or maybe another way of putting it, of birth, which is kind of death and birth and both, is who are we sitting with in the waiting room? Because a lot of birth and death is the waiting. And maybe the language of pregnancy or eternal, procreation could shift a bit so that we could talk about who's in our waiting room and who are we with through the moments of their lives. I've sat with people who have been working to figure out their abortion. I've sat with somebody who's had their first haircut as a person that's queer, and somebody who, upon being gossiped and lost a community, scattered feathers into the wind as part of ritualizing a Jewish story. But each of us is leading and living a Jewish story. The question is, do our communities and our places want to hear it? And I hope on the birthday of the world, we can think about this. And in this year of release, we can think about what are our holdings and how can we be a bit more generous in love and in hope for each of us and our lives.
There were two other areas we talked about in advance, kind of covering today, and I noticed that we're about 5 minutes out from where I wanted to stop, but I'm hoping we can go a few minutes into the Q&A and maybe extend that time by another 5 minutes, because I think they're both really powerful areas. One is actually picking up on what Devin just said about the sense of like what value you bring, or I want to reframe that a little, because I was reading Aviva Zornberg. She's a Torah scholar, and she wrote about Sarai, like Abraham and Sarah, Sarai before she was Sarah, before she's renamed in covenant with God. And many of us know that she conceived and bore a child when she was postmenopausal, around 90 years old, right? This is part of the Torah legacy that we're offered. And it's a really miraculous story. But the word that's used to describe her in the Torah is akara. And it's usually translated, it has a dual meaning of both barren and rootless. And I want to think about that a little bit. What's the relationship between not being a parent and feeling rootless? And Alex, I wonder if there's something in there that you've experienced in your own journey. And Devin, I think you're kind of touching on that a little bit in terms of what you were just saying about how you were thinking about, like, where do I fit? What does it mean to be, like, what is my contribution here, right? So maybe Alex, maybe you want to pick that up if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, just quickly in the interest of time, I never felt badly about myself, and I think it's a very personal experience. And when I wrote the book, sort of unpacked that a bit, and I thought it had a lot to do with how my husband and I interacted around this. All of the fertility issues were on my side, but I never felt like, and I was aware if he was, trying to procreate with a 26-year-old, it probably would not have been a significant challenge for him. But I was in my early 30s and it was. So I didn't feel badly about myself, but I don't think there's universality to that. I think it's a very personal experience. What I did feel was incredible pain, because I identified in going through this that I really wanted to be a parent, and I was open to different ways of doing that. But that was so fierce and so inside me that standing there thinking, this may not happen, it certainly might not happen the way I thought it would, if at all, was very difficult. And I do think that part of our identity, and Heather touched on this at the beginning, there is a universality to the desire to parent. And it's not that everyone has to make that choice, but it's broad, it's deep, it's powerful. And that was what was hardest, was feeling like this choice that's so important may have been taken away from me because I didn't know what I needed to know and ask the things I needed to ask to set myself up for, moving down this path. But I think it's a very personal experience for people.
Yeah, and thank you. Devin, do you want to pick up on that thread at all?
No, I'm just soaking in the wisdom, so much wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because Zornberg goes on to talk about this idea of lech lecha, which is foundational to so much of our Jewish understanding. Abraham is told to go forth from your father's land, right? And this idea that she interprets this idea of the akara, that being this place is somehow sterile for them. And so they have to go to a new place that holds new creative possibilities. And I think that's something that I'm constantly trying to imagine for myself in my own life. What is that? But Heather, I wanted to pick up on this idea of the 90-year-old, because I just was curious to know where things stand right now in terms of what the science says about where people's possibilities are at if they do want to pursue the fertility path or the parent path.
Well, I'm laughing because I remember many years ago giving a talk on age and infertility, and my first slide was a quote from a very famous person that said there was some age limit, and my second quote was Sarah was 90, and I sort of said, who are you going to believe? So when you ask me how I think you asked me about how Be Fruitful and Multiply impacts my personal or professional life. I see every story as one of infertility. So that's my world. I would just, before I answer your question, and I promise I would say I personally, even though I spend every day trying to help people make babies, I'm a little bit offended at putting barren and rootless together. I don't think that is a fair summary of most of the people that I work with. But I would also say, technically, we make a distinction between procreate and reproduce. So reproduce is, what plants do, providing genetic material. Procreate is literally creating life. So if the question is, at what age can a woman carry a pregnancy? Certainly safely into her 50s. Beyond that, there might be some questions, there might be some ethical questions about ability to parent into the future. If the question is prolonging the function of the ovary, we're been pretty dismal failure on that. So what I commonly tell my patients, every person you read about in People magazine who's had a baby over 40 has used another woman's egg until proven otherwise, which doesn't change what I said, because you are still procreating, you are still creating a family. So the short answer is you can probably safely have a family and carry a pregnancy until into your 50s. You can have a family without carrying it probably into a much later age because there isn't the same physical challenge.
Thank you. That's fascinating. The last piece I want to pick up and sort of unpack with you is the socioeconomic piece of all of this. It's just there right on the surface, right? When we're talking about paths to fertility and IVF and adoption or surrogacy and all of these different options that people maybe are exploring. I was really struck because I don't know how many of you know it. I'm going to put this link in the chat. This is Naomi Less's Eli talk. Yeah, here, this should give you the link. If you haven't seen it, it's worth a view. Naomi, as I mentioned earlier, is a spiritual leader at Lab Shul. She's a singer-songwriter, and she's a storyteller, like a person who interprets the Torah through the Bible. And by the way, I just wanted to say, Heather, I wanted to be clear that it wasn't me who put Akara, the barren and rootless.
No.
It wasn't Thornburg either. You have to take that one up with the writers of the Torah. And
no, that's my point. That's exactly my point. Yes, I agree.
For sure, it's hard. It's so hard to hear that. Right? Yes. But anyway, Naomi Less is really, her talk is really a pitch to philanthropists. It's really about that, because she says we put about $3,000 per person into birthright programs. And one of the donors of Birthright, one of the founders of the program to send people, like young people, to Israel to explore Israel, has been on record as saying that one of the major aims of the Birthright program is to try to match Jewish people to each other, and thereby hopefully ensuring procreative continuity. And she's saying, well, this is like 5 to 15 years out at best, maybe longer. And there are a whole bunch of us sitting in waiting rooms in fertility clinics, recognizing each other from our camp circuits and schools and stuff, who are ready now to start a family. And she's recreated this idea. She's created a new idea called the birth rate program instead of birthright. And she says donors should actually be putting money into helping people. She's working in an American context, so I don't know how the landscape maybe changes here, but she's saying to people, like, put money into helping people start the families that they're looking for now, when they're ready now and they're struggling now. And otherwise it gets too easy, she says, to internalize that having a Jewish family is just for the haves. right? That it's something out of reach for people who don't have the capacity, the economic capacity to do it. So I wondered, Heather and Alex in particular, because I know you've both in different ways done work around this, Heather from the physician side, from the medical side, and Alex from the policy side. Can you speak a little bit to the landscape of what we're actually looking at in Canada right now? How, you know, what kinds of resources exist to support people? Where is it necessary? And what do you want to see? Like, what policy changes or other supports do we need now? Maybe Heather first.
Well, I was going to suggest maybe Alex wants to talk, because I think in the foreword of your book, you mentioned two really important organizations and your role with them in this book.
Yeah, just briefly, you know, in writing this book, the two motivations for me were, one, the awareness piece. I was conscious that from when I was going through this 15 years ago, very little had changed. And I still hear 32-year-old women say, maybe I'll have a baby one day. And I'm like, oh, well, get the facts, get your information, be aware. So that was one. And the second was going through this. I have a very unusual story, and I knew that while I was in it, and that was just the longevity of the journey. But we had money to try and do different things, and we used surrogates, and you know, I did a bazillion IVFs, and I couldn't believe going through it that the dividing line between someone ending up with a family and someone not was just money, given everything we say about the importance of children. That was like a dagger in my heart then. A huge motivation for writing the book was that has to change, and we've got to engage people in a 21st century conversation around family building that's relevant to today's realities, not the realities of my mom. And the author royalties for the book go to two amazing organizations, Conceivable Dreams and Fertility Matters. They're sophisticated, they're doing great work. They're pushing businesses to put fertility benefits in health plans. They're pushing governments to fund IVF. But we need to engage people around this, so it isn't the, you know, selfish, career-focused woman who waited too long stereotype that dominates our conversation. But anyone who wants to be a parent should have an opportunity to become a parent if we really value family building and kids the way we say we do. And I say in the book, let's start backing up this statement with our actions, not just our words. And the biggest thing we can do is, whether it's adoption, whether it's fostering kids, whether it's fertility treatments, make those options available to people and make family building and the choice a meaningful one, and don't let the dividing line be money.
So I would say that fertility treatments can be expensive, absolutely. And it also breaks my heart that people can't afford to do what they want. It also breaks my heart that I can offer them a government-funded program that's of about a $10,000 value that comes with about $5,000 more of costs of drugs. And even though they're employed and their company has benefits, the most common thing that a company excludes in benefits are fertility drugs. And so what message does that tell you? And we haven't even started talking about egg freezing, which is another very complicated subject as well. But yes, it's a societal problem. And I think one thing I've learned is to try not to frame it as a medical problem. I think it's much more helpful to frame it as a societal problem. And there's lots of places where we can start by telling young people that you should be worried about your fertility. So things like family doctors, instead of saying to people, what are you doing for contraception, saying after that, and what are your plans for contraception? It's an easy little thing. And I think those are things that we're working on. And all of those things sort of tie into the financial piece.
And Shironi, I'll just add quickly, I say in the book, and I've said, like, we love our doctors, we need our doctors, but for my doctor to give me meaningful information on how to prevent diabetes is fantastic. I want my doctor to give me meaningful information on preserving my fertility and my opportunity to build a family. And that conversation has to start much earlier than it is. They have a privileged role in our life, and we need them to step into that and be really advocating for greater awareness than is currently the case.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Devin, I'm going to flip the question to you just for the end here, and then we'll open it up to the floor. You and I have talked a little bit about the wills that you and your husband have put together, and I wondered if you can say just a little bit about what this means to support Jewish lives full of belonging, full of, you know, boundless creativity and a legacy with or without children.
Yes, absolutely. And I really value that conversation we had, Sharoni, because curiously, our final wills arrived literally 10 minutes before we had this conversation. Been working on our wills and doing all this planning for our lives this whole summer, and it just feels like a culmination. I want to say a word of Torah quickly before that, because it relates to why I decided to do wills at the tender age of 33. So I had been reading these narratives, and it's very common actually in narratives related to the state of Israel and some of the Torah that came out in the Yeshuv about the sacrifice of Isaac and, you know, the binding of Isaac. And that, you know, oh, you know, Isaac, you know, of course, like it's faith, it's a leap of faith. You read that a lot. But as time went on after the Yeshuv, this narrative shifted to like, wait a second, like, should a child sacrifice themselves for a parent? Like, does this really make sense? And it was actually the poet-writer, Shulamit Haraven, who challenges in a really gorgeous book to create sort of a more maternal kind of narrative, but she also means it in a multiple gendered way, which is that rather than sacrifice ourselves and live lives that are not our own and belong to us, that actually we should write our own endings to our own stories in our own lands. This is what led us to make our own wills. My partner and I do not have heirs. I adore children. I want to make that clear. I'm a very happy aunt to many people and dogs, actually. But we decided that we would give away our wealth to organizations that really benefit people that have struggled. So that meant for me, all of my youth outreach workers, everybody who ever wrote me a letter of reference when I had no money to afford going to school. For him, it meant the place where he got support as a adult with autism. It meant giving to the kind of world and the kind of providers, including synagogue professionals, wink, wink, Sharoni, that deserve to be compensated and supported in ways that often our institutions don't. So we thought we want ourselves to be able to life to live on more than just us, you know, and that in the names of all the people that have helped us, that's what we should build as a Jewish community. And it should be the wider, because keep in mind, our ancestors are not just our ancestors, you know. Isaac had a sibling, Ishmael. There's a wider conversation to be had, both about fertility and also about lives. And it relates to everything from basic income to, you know, just how to be able to support people so they can live. So that's what we're hoping to do, is give it away to all the people and places that are supporting life. And that's what we hope to build in a Jewish community.
Beautiful. Thank you. I want to open it up to the floor. I know we're going to maybe be a couple of minutes over if people are willing, and if you're not, just tell me and we'll just close it. That's okay. But I just want to say a reflection on Cynthia Ozick offers a reading of the HaShanah story. Cynthia Ozick, a great American Jewish author, offers a reading of the HaShanah story where she refocuses on a part that is often overlooked in this conversation, which is the moment where Elkanah, the husband, turns to Hannah and says to her, "Why are you crying? Why aren't you eating? Am I not good enough? Or am I not as good for you as 10 sons?" And yes, one could say he's missing the point of her pain, but Ozick chooses to reread that as an expression of seeing her as a person separated from her instrumentality as a walking womb, so to speak, right? So I wanted to offer, just as a closing word, that for all of us here, for all of us listening, for all of the people that we tend to in our different roles, may we all be enough. May we all feel that we are enough. We are enough as we are, and we are full, and we have value in community. And I want us to be seen and held and appreciated. And I hope that this is just one of many conversations that we can have about this kind of theme. It's really important work. And I really am so grateful to Heather and Alex and Devin for shaping this conversation today and sharing all of these beautiful insights and these words of lived Torah. Thank you. So